We're going to be looking at interpreting tables and graphs for a 2x2 factorial design, looking for possible main effects and or interactions. In our scenario, we're going to focus on length of handshake and how is it affected by the gender of the voter, male or female, and the gender of the political candidate, male or female. For this first scenario, we're going to consider main effect for voters' gender only. So here are male voters shaking hands for 1 second with the political candidate, irregardless of that candidate's gender. The female voter is shaking hands for 2 seconds, irregardless of the political candidate's gender. When we calculate the average for handshaking, male voter averages 1 second, female voter averages 2 seconds. So we're seeing a possible main effect here based upon the voter's gender. But notice for the political candidate, when we collapse across or average across the voter's gender, we see an average of 1.5 seconds of handshaking for the male and an average of 1.5 seconds of handshaking for the female, not indicative of a main effect. So only one main effect is taking place here. When we graph the results, our male voter is shaking hands on average for 1 second with male and female candidates, and the female voter on average for 2 seconds. This difference between the male voter and the female voter is our main effect. Notice the lines are parallel. That means it's unlikely that there's an interaction. Okay, what if there's a main effect for both the candidate's gender and the voter's gender? In this scenario, our male voter is shaking hands for 1 second with the male candidate. If the candidate is female, there's an extra second of handshaking, and if the voter is female, there's an extra second of handshaking. Based upon this, if these effects are additive, if there's a female candidate shaking hands with a female voter, we should see 3 seconds of handshaking, +1 because the candidate is female and +1 because the voter is female. When we look at the averages, the male voter on average shaking hands for 1.5 seconds, the female voter on average for 2.5 seconds. That's indicative of a main effect for the voter's gender. For the political candidate, 1.5 seconds for the male candidate, 2.5 seconds for the female candidate, again indicative of a main effect for the political candidate's gender. In terms of graphing the results, here's our male shaking hands for 1 second with the male voter, and the male voter shaking hands for 2 seconds with the female candidate. The female voter is shaking hands 1 second longer with both scenarios. Also, the female voter is shaking hands for a whole second longer compared to the male voter. Notice these lines are parallel, indicating that there's not an interaction. Now, what if there were no main effects, but only an interaction? Well, here's our male voter shaking hands for 1 second with the male candidate. If the candidate is female or if the voter is female, there's an additional 1 second of handshaking. But there's not going to be a main effect this time. So instead of this being 3 seconds, if the female voter shakes hands with the female candidate, back down to 1 second. When we calculate the averages, the male voter is shaking hands on average for 1.5 seconds and the female voter on average for 1.5 seconds. No main effect. For the political candidate's gender, male political candidate, 1.5 seconds, female political candidate, 1.5 seconds. Again, no main effect here. When we graph the results, our male candidate shaking hands with the male voter for 1 second, male voter shaking hands for 2 seconds with the female candidate. The female voter, it's the opposite trend. And notice how these lines intersect. That is, they are not parallel. That's indicative that there's an interaction. What if there is a main effect of the candidate's gender and also an interaction between the voter and candidate's gender? Here we have our male voter who's shaking hands for only 1 second with the male candidate, but 3 seconds with the female candidate. For our female voter, it doesn't matter the political candidate's gender, 2 seconds in either case. When we calculate our averages, for the male voter, 2 seconds, female voter, 2 seconds. No main effect here. But for the political candidate, male voter shaking hands for 1.5 seconds, female for 2.5 seconds. We see a main effect here for the political candidate's gender. When we graph our results, here we have for our male voter, here we have for the female voter. Notice that there's an interaction. These lines are overlapping, they're intersecting. Also, the male candidate is shaking hands on average less than the female candidate. So that's indicative of a main effect for the political candidate's gender.